This Christmas season, we're surrounded by everything we want. But what about the gifts we truly need? Today, we'll explore how God meets us in practical ways through the greatest gift of all, Jesus. Jesus is the gift with the power to transform our lives. This Christmas, let's open our hearts to what we truly need.
Well, good morning, everyone. I am so glad that you are here as we kick off our brand new Christmas series together. As always, I'm excited about the holiday season. I know it's hard for a lot of you to believe, but Christmas is only about 3 weeks away. Now, for others of you, it's not hard to believe because it's 40 degrees outside in South Mississippi and Thanksgiving is over. And so it is starting to feel a lot like Christmas. And so I just want to start this Christmas series by getting us to think a little bit about the Christmas story together. And so I just want to ask you, when you think about the Christmas story, what do you think about? How many of you jokers, honestly, right now are thinking about Ralphie's mom saying, "You're going to shoot your eye out"? Anybody, that's what you think about when you think about the Christmas story? Or even better, how about the leg lamp? Anybody remember the leg lamp? Wow. Does anybody own a leg lamp? I'm just curious. Okay, we're going to need to get you into counseling after service, okay? We're going to get you some help, right? Hey, that is not the Christmas story that we are talking about this season. We're talking about the real Christmas story. We're going to be talking a lot about the birth of Jesus. There are a lot of churches that love to talk about the Christmas story this time of the year. And when they do, they typically focus on the miraculous side of Christmas, right? You'll hear a lot about the virgin birth. It's very common for us to hear about the star that miraculously appeared in the sky that led the wise men to find the newborn baby Jesus. You'll hear other pastors who'll be talking about prophecies that were fulfilled that could have never been fulfilled if it wasn't for divine intervention. And all of that stuff is great. It's incredibly helpful because when you really understand the miraculous side of Christmas, it builds and bolsters your faith in Jesus. But I want to spend our time together this Christmas season not talking about the miraculous side. I want to spend our time talking about the practical side of the Christmas story. This is why we're calling the series Practically Christmas. Isaiah the prophet, he wrote about the coming of Jesus roughly 700 years before Jesus would even be born. But when he wrote about Jesus, he highlighted some of the practical ways that Jesus would radically change people's lives. I want you to listen to what he wrote in Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6. He said, "For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, and Prince of Peace." During this Christmas season, we're going to spend a lot of time together on that one verse and specifically those 4 titles. But today, I just want to start and I want us to focus only on that name, Wonderful Counselor. Now, unfortunately, I know that there is a stigma that is often associated with counseling. The truth is, a lot of us could benefit from counseling, but we're really reluctant to go to counseling for one reason or another. For some people, they would think, I'm never going to go to counseling because in a small town, I don't want people to see my car at the shrink's office. Like, what would people think of me, right? I've had other people tell me that they would never go to counseling because they don't really believe that counseling can help them. That they say things like, those people don't even know me. How in the world would they be able to help me. Others are reluctant to go to counseling because they think they can fix their own problems. And yet, they've been trying for a long time to fix their own problems, but their problems aren't getting any better. And so if you're the kind of person who thinks, I would never go to counseling, I want to challenge the way you think. Counseling is not a sign of weakness. It's a commitment to strength. I want you to think about it like this. When you see someone walking into a gym, do you think to yourself, they are so weak? No, that's not the way we think at all. You look at them and you think, now that's someone who is strong and they are committed to getting even stronger. That's someone who cares about their health, and so they're working at getting even healthier. A gym membership is not a sign of weakness. It really is a commitment to strength. And the same is true when it comes to counseling. You need to understand that you are not just a physical being. You are an emotional being. You are a mental being. You are a relational being. You have a spiritual side to your life. And so you need to learn to care for the whole self, not just the physical side of yourself. The people who are actually talking about their marriage, they typically have a stronger marriage. It's the people who can't talk about their marriage. It's the people who refuse to talk about their marriage who are usually struggling with a weak marriage. The people who actually talk through big decisions and major transitions, they typically handle those things very, very well. It's the people who can't talk about it or won't talk about it that usually end up having a lot of regrets about it. But the people who talk through their problems, the people who talk about the pain from their past, they usually heal from their past and they learn from the past. But people who can't talk about it or won't talk about it, they are haunted by their past. My point is simply this: counseling is not a sign of weakness. It really is a commitment to strength. Now, if you're going to go to a counselor, you need to go to a wonderful counselor, okay? And so I'm just going to tell you right now, I've been to some counselors who were really bad counselors, okay? I've been in those places where I paid money and I spent an hour of my life and I walked out thinking that didn't help me at all. In fact, 19 years ago, Steph and I went through a really, really rough patch in our marriage. Neither one of us were happy. And I really do think that we were both at our breaking point. We should have found a counselor sooner rather than later, but we didn't, because like so many people, we avoided counseling for so long that our little problems became really, really big problems. And so by the time we finally went to counseling, we really needed a wonderful counselor, okay? We tried a couple of counselors, and quite frankly, they were no help at all. But then we walked into a guy's office whose name was Ron, and Ron was the most wonderful counselor that I have ever met. God used Ron to save my marriage, and God used Ron to radically change my life. I am not a perfect man. My wife will tell you that. My kids will tell you that. Anyone who knows me will tell you that. But I'm going to tell you this: I am nowhere near the same man that I was when I first walked into Ron's office. I've spent a lot of time over the last couple of weeks really thinking about what made Ron so much better than all of the other counselors that we tried to see. And I really do believe that the things that made Ron such a wonderful counselor are the same things that made Jesus such a wonderful counselor. In fact, I think Ron would tell you that he got all of his best traits and all of his best qualities from Jesus himself. And so today I want to introduce you to a side of Jesus that I bet most of you have never thought about before. I want you to leave today knowing that Jesus really is the wonderful counselor, and his appointment book is always open to you. Now, to do this today, I'm going to tell you a story about Jesus and Peter. And so it's not a story about the newborn baby Jesus. It's a story about adult Jesus who actually serves as a wonderful counselor for Peter. Now, as you think about this counseling session between Jesus and Peter, I want to point out to you that most of the time, counseling is completely confidential, okay? But that is not the case with Peter and his counseling session with Jesus. In fact, it's not confidential at all. It's recorded in the Bible for the entire world to read. That's embarrassing, okay? If you're Peter, you're like, really? Like, you got to use me in this example like that. But Jesus does, and the reason why is because it will encourage you. See, if you don't know anything about Peter, you need to know that when the church got started in the book of Acts, Peter was the leader of the early church. In fact, Catholics believe that Peter was the very first pope ever. And so if someone like Peter needed a session or two with the wonderful counselor, then you can give yourself some grace and be like, you know what? Maybe I could use a session or two with the wonderful counselor as well. Now, at this point in the story, in John chapter 21, Jesus has already been crucified. Jesus has already been buried in the ground, and he's been raised from the dead, but he is still on the earth, and he's getting ready to meet with Peter. Now, the question is, do you know what Peter was doing in the days after the resurrection of Jesus? He was fishing. Now, to Peter's credit, it had been a great morning of fishing. John actually tells us in some of these verses that Peter and his friends caught 153 large fish. But Jesus had so much more that he wanted Peter to be doing with his life. He didn't call him to be a fisherman. If you remember the very first time they met, Jesus called him to be a fisher of men. He told Peter, he said, I want you to stop spending all your time looking for fish, and I want you to start spending all your time looking for people who are far away from God. Jesus literally had a plan to use Peter to change other people's lives and in a very real way to change the world. But at this point in the story, it seems like Peter has had a relapse. He's gone back to this old way of life rather than following God's plan for his life. And I think the reason that he did this is because he had blown it in a really big way. Just days earlier, Peter had denied that he even knew Jesus at all. In fact, I think that if you were to ask Peter about his whole life, he would have told you that this was the lowest point in my life. That was the greatest regret in my life. The question is, how is he going to handle that? Is he going to own up to it? Is he going to heal from it? Is he going to learn anything from it? Because if he didn't deal with the past, he would never be able to thrive in the future. Now, I'm going to tell you something about Peter that's true of you, it's true of me, and it was true of him. Peter doesn't want to deal with it. Peter says it's just easier to revert back to my old way of life rather than facing up to this stuff. And so that's what Peter's doing at this point in the story. He's out there fishing all morning, hanging out with some guys in the boat, and they look up on the shoreline. And when they look up on this shoreline, they see Jesus. He's got a fire going, and he invites them to come join him for breakfast. And this is what happened. John 21, 12-19. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." None of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. Jesus came, took the bread and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. This was now the third time that Jesus had appeared to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said. "You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again, Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, take care of my sheep. The third time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, do you love me? He said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my sheep. Very truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and you went where you wanted, but when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, follow me. If you look down in verse 14, John tells us that this was the third time that Jesus has appeared to his own disciples after the resurrection. And so prior to the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, Peter had blown it in a big way, okay? He did not just deny that he knew Jesus once or twice. He had denied him 3 different times. And so in a very real way, he felt like he had betrayed someone that he loved, and he did it in a way that exposed the fact that he had very real character flaws in his life. And so now Jesus is saying, you're going to come and we're going to talk about it. Literally, Peter is having a come to Jesus meeting, okay? Some of your parents say, come on, we're going to have a come to Jesus meeting. He literally had a come to Jesus meeting. Now, I think that Peter is like most of us in that he doesn't want to talk about it. In fact, everything we read in this passage, it suggests that this topic has not been discussed, even though he has already seen Jesus 2 different times. Peter is probably hoping that Jesus has somehow forgotten about everything that happened. But Jesus is going to make him talk about it because he knows that Peter cannot thrive in the future until he has first dealt with the past. And the same is true in your life. You cannot thrive in the future until you have first dealt with your past. Jesus had big plans for Peter. He was going to use Peter to launch the church, to start a revolution that would literally change the world. In a matter of weeks, Jesus has a plan to use Peter to preach a message in which, in one message, 3,000 people are going to convert from Judaism to Christianity. But before any of that could ever happen, Jesus is going to make Peter deal with his past. Peter had to first and foremost deal with the guilt. He had to know that Jesus really had forgiven him and that Jesus loved him and that Jesus still believed in him and wanted to use him. And if he didn't deal with that guilt, then I promise you this, he would have stepped into that leadership role in the church and he would have been crippled by all kinds of doubts, by feelings of insecurities, and his future would have never been all that God really wanted it to be. Listen to me. If you have blown it like Peter blew it, you can't have confidence in yourself until you first hear from Jesus that he still has confidence in you. See, Jesus is not just a part of your life. You have a spiritual enemy who is also at work in your life. And I promise you this, Satan himself would have been in Peter's ear saying things to him like, dude, who do you think you are? You're out there telling everybody else to follow Jesus, and yet you were the one who denied even knowing Jesus. You are such a hypocrite. You need to hang it up. You can't do this job. Listen to me, man. Peter would have spent the rest of his life beating himself up if he had not taken some time to meet with the wonderful counselor who would build him back up first. See, this is what counselors do. A wonderful counselor will help you process the past so that it doesn't hinder you in the future. Peter not only had to learn or deal with the guilt of his past, he had to also learn from the mistakes in his past. Listen to me. If you don't learn from your mistakes, it is really easy for you to repeat those mistakes. And this is so true, especially in Peter's life. Think about it. When Peter denied Jesus the first time around, he denied him in the presence of a teenage girl. This little girl who was saying, I know you. I know you're a follower of Jesus. She didn't have the power to do anything to Peter. But let me tell you something. This would not be the last time that Peter would be pressured to deny Jesus. In fact, in this very conversation, Jesus is warning Peter in verses 18 and 19 that he will face this same temptation all over again. I want you to listen to what Jesus told him. He said, when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, follow me. At some point in his future, Jesus knew that Peter was going to be pressured to deny Jesus all over again. He would be told, you've got to stop speaking about Jesus. You've got to deny the reality of the resurrection of Jesus. But this time around, he would not be pressured by a teenage girl. He would be pressured instead by people in power who would stretch out his arms and crucify him just like they crucified Jesus. Peter had to learn from his mistakes so that he did not repeat those same mistakes in the future. That's not just true in Peter's life. That's true in your life and in my life. Let me ask you, what mistakes have you made in your past that you cannot afford to repeat in your future? This is why you have to think about it and talk about it. You don't just need to heal from it. You really do need to learn from it. I talk to guys all the time who tell me about the big mistakes that they've made in their life, and they tell me things like, I don't know why I did it, but I promise you this, preacher, I'm never going to do it again. I tell them every time, if you don't know why you did it, I promise you this, you will do it again. This is why you've got to process things with the wonderful counselor. This is why you need to think about the mistakes that you've made. This is why you need to grow in self-awareness. You need to discover that in most cases, you were trying to meet a real need, but you were trying to meet it in a really unhealthy way. But most people don't want to do that. You know why? Because it hurts. It hurts to talk about the past. Look back at verse 17. The third time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, do you love me? He said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Peter knew exactly what Jesus was doing. Peter had denied Jesus 3 different times. And so Jesus is going to make him confess his love for Christ 3 different times. But let me tell you, this is a painful moment for Peter. That this is probably one of those moments that hurt his pride, right? All the other disciples are there, that they didn't publicly deny Jesus. And yet here Jesus is calling him out. And he's hurt his pride. This probably hurt Peter at an emotional level. Like to go back and to think about the fact that I denied the one that I love the most. I'm telling you, to deal with your past, it really does hurt, and it's a painful experience. It hurts to think about what you have done to others. It hurts to think about what others have done to you. It hurts to talk about your biggest regrets and your most painful failures. But if you don't talk about it, and if you don't think about it, you will never learn anything from it. Now, I know it's hard to talk about stuff like this, but I'm going to tell you right now, it's a whole lot easier to talk about it with Jesus, who really is a wonderful counselor. Listen, one of the things that makes Jesus such a wonderful counselor is that he is compassionate. If you read this entire story, you will notice that there is not one time where Jesus scolds Peter or where he condemns Peter or even criticizes Peter for what he has done in his past. In fact, when you read the story, he's very gentle with Peter. In fact, Jesus is not only compassionate toward Peter, Jesus felt this way about all people. I want you to listen to what Matthew said about Jesus in Matthew chapter 9, verse 36. He wrote this. He said, when he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. Compassion is one of those qualities that makes someone a truly wonderful counselor. See, Jesus doesn't just see what you do. Jesus sees and he understands why you do it. He knows that you have a spiritual enemy in your life that is harassing you. Now, you may not know that, but Jesus knows that because he doesn't just see the physical world, he sees the spiritual world. He knows that humans are like sheep who are kind of wandering around in life and they're easily led astray by the world around them. And because of the way he sees people, Jesus has real compassion for people. The second thing that makes Jesus such a wonderful counselor is that he has real credibility. Listen to me. It's really hard for you to talk to someone if they don't understand what you're struggling with. If they don't understand you, I promise you, it will feel like they are only judging you. But let me tell you something about Jesus. Jesus not only knows your struggles, Jesus knows how to help you overcome those struggles. In fact, I want you to listen to what the author of Hebrews said about Jesus in Hebrews chapter 4, verse 15. He said, "For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with us in our weakness, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin." See, this is one of those things that is so beneficial about God becoming a man in the person of Jesus. He is able to empathize with us. He is able to understand us. He's able to, therefore, lead us. This is why he said to Peter in verse 19, "You need to follow me." Jesus knows how to overcome the struggle that you face in your life. He knew it in your life. He knew it in Peter's life. And this is why he's saying to Peter, Peter, you got to follow my example. You got to follow my teachings. You got to listen to what I'm saying to you. And the same is true in our lives. If we are simply willing to follow his teachings and follow his examples, then the wonderful counselor will help us overcome. Now, I'm going to tell you right now, one of the reasons that it is so easy for me to follow Jesus is because Jesus doesn't just have compassion and credibility, but Jesus has incredible wisdom. If you follow Jesus long enough, I promise you, you will grow to admire and respect and cherish the wisdom that he speaks into your life. Jesus, in this story, he had the wisdom to know what would keep Peter living like a prisoner of his past. And so he focused on that in order to lead him into the future. 3 different times, Jesus asked Peter, he said, "Peter, do you love me?" 3 different times, Peter said, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And 3 different times, Jesus responded to him and he said, "I want you to feed my sheep," or "I want you to take care of my people." You know what Jesus is telling him? Jesus is telling him, it's time for you to forget about your failures in the past, and it's time for you to focus on my purpose for your life in the future. If Jesus has forgiven it, then you can forget about it. But the reason that past bothers so many people is because they haven't dealt with it. But when you deal with the past, you don't have to live in the past. You really can experience his forgiveness. You really can experience his love. You really can be healed so that you are stronger now than you've ever been in your life. In fact, I would tell you that if you have healed from your past and if you have learned from your past, then you are the perfect person to help other people overcome their past. That's exactly what happened in Peter's life, and I promise you this, it can happen in your life too. And so let me just ask you, what part of your past have you not dealt with? What mistake did you make? What wound hasn't healed? What part of your past is going to hinder you in the future if you don't deal with it now? I hope that as a result of this message that you will see a Christian counselor, but I also want you to develop a very real relationship with the wonderful counselor whose name is Jesus. Now, I know that it's really hard for you to envision what that could look like, because you know and I know that Jesus isn't going to come down here and meet with you after work sometime next week. And so I want to help you see what it could look like for you to know the wonderful counselor Jesus in a very personal way. A couple of weeks ago, I sat down with my wife and we recorded a video where we could explain more fully how Jesus was and how Jesus continues to be our wonderful counselor. I want you to check it out.
So in the message, I spent a lot of time talking about Ron, who is a wonderful counselor, but I want to spend our time talking a lot more about Jesus and how Jesus is a wonderful counselor. I think people hear that, Steph, and I think a lot of times it's like, well, what's that practically look like? Like, Jesus isn't coming down to meet with them 5 o'clock after work on a Wednesday afternoon. And yet you and I have both experienced in a very real way what it feels like for Jesus to be our wonderful counselor. So what's that look like?
Well, I think one thing that I love me some Ron, one thing he always did for us is he helped us have perspective, priorities, and what's the end game. And I think in the same way, the Holy Spirit will tell us, hey, let's keep in mind these are small things. These are light and momentary. There is something to look forward to. There is something better coming. And I mean, that always just helps calm my anxiety and my worries when I realize these are just light and momentary troubles. There's an eternal life out there. There's good things to come. And so that perspective, just getting in his presence, gives me perspective.
Yeah, you're so easy just to focus on the problem.
Right.
Rather than maintaining a perspective and seeing your situation the way God sees it, whether that was the difficult season of our marriage or the difficult season in parenting our 2 children, those perspectives were a game changer. What else?
Right. I feel like the promises he gives me when I need them, you know, like I think about the times that I'm worried about the kids because I got a mama's heart. You know.
Oh, yeah.
So
You always say a mom is never is only as happy as her least happy child.
that's not very healthy, but that's
But it's a reality.
It is a reality.
Yeah.
But anyway, so through the years, you know, as I see my kids, maybe their missteps, or even when I'm misstepping, I go back to the promise in Philippians 1:6 that says, being confident of this, he's going to complete the work that he has began in them. Like he's going to work it out. He's going to work out their salvation. He's going to work it out. And everything is going to be okay. And that's given me so much comfort.
It is. And so when you get into the presence of Jesus, what happens is you move from that place where you're going, I have to fix this,
Right.
whether it's my spouse or my kids. And he reminds you in a very real way, in a personal session, no, you don't have to fix this. I'm going to fix this because I am the one who is completing the good work that I started.
That's right.
That's great. Yeah. You know, for me, one of the things I always go back to is I go back to those seasons where we were either struggling in our marriage or we were struggling with one of our kids. And typically speaking, we were struggling because I wasn't obeying. And so I can look back on those seasons, and when I would go spend some time alone with Jesus, he would remind me of very clear commands and going, the reason you got into this mess is because you weren't doing as a husband or as a father what I told you to do in the first place. And those commands were powerful because think in a normal counseling session, the counselor is often trying to help you discover the answer for yourself. And it's like, dude, that's not what Jesus does. In fact, The Gospels record over and over again that when the people heard Jesus teaching, they were amazed because he taught as one who had authority. And so for me to get along with Jesus and think about the commands that he's given and to know, like, dude, this isn't an option. This isn't a suggestion. This is a command. And if you will obey what the wonderful counselor is telling you to do, things will get a whole lot better in your situation.
That's good.
Anything else that when you get along with Jesus, this is what he does for you as the wonderful counselor that really does help in a practical way?
Another thing he does for me is he will just give me a word, and it'll just be random. And I remember, and I think you know about this, I've told you about this, but when we were in a difficult season of our marriage, I remember pulling up in my dad's driveway right beside the garage. I remember it was the moon shining. I mean, the whole thing, it was so vivid. And I just upset and just thinking and scared to death. And it was like the Lord just said, I am still on the throne. And in that moment, I just had immeasurable peace. Yeah. And it was like, whatever happens, I'm okay, because he's on the throne.
That's right. But just like you would schedule an appointment with a counselor on this earth, you've got to schedule those appointments and get along with God so that he can give you the perspective, so that he can give you the promises and the commands and those words of encouragement. Now, when he gives them to you, I think it's really important that we don't lose them. So tell everybody what you do when God speaks to you in the way that he speaks to us in those wonderful counseling sessions.
Yeah. So, I have a bad memory, first of all. So I write down a lot of things. So I have all these little cards, and they're all over our house. It's junky. My bathroom mirrors everywhere. But so when he gives us or gives me a promise or an encouragement or whatever, a thought, I'll jot it down and I'll just have it in front of me so I can always remember those special moments. And so when I start to doubt, start to get worried, at times I'll carry them around with me. I'll yank that card out and I'll remember.
Yeah. And so that's the power of spending some time alone with the wonderful counselor. He can speak to us. He can give us exactly what we need to get through the trial that we're in. And if you don't know that, then you can't benefit from that. And so get alone with Jesus and let him be your wonderful counselor.